June 7th, 1997. Savannah, Georgia. A 3-year-old girl wearing a purple dress vanished from her own backyard birthday party in less than 90 seconds. 24 years later, when FBI agents finally discovered what happened to her, they uncovered an illegal adoption network that had been operating across America for decades, stealing children from celebrations and selling them to desperate families, willing to pay any price for a child. But the most devastating part of this story isn't just how she disappeared or where she ended up. It's what happened when her mother finally found her after more than 2 decades of searching and realized that sometimes finding the truth doesn't bring the closure you've spent your entire life desperately seeking. Madison Grant was 3 years old on the day her childhood ended and someone else's began. She was a quiet child, the kind who observed the world with careful attention rather than demanding its focus. She spoke in short sentences, preferred solitary play with her stuffed animals, and trusted adults with the complete faith that only very young children possess. On that warm June afternoon in 1997, she wore her favorite purple dress with white polka dots, tiny white shoes that her mother had bought specifically for this special occasion, and a small silver bracelet with her name engraved on it. Her 3rd birthday party was supposed to be a magical celebration filled with laughter, cake, and the kind of innocent joy that makes childhood memories precious. Instead, it became the last day her parents would ever see their daughter's face. The Grant family lived in Whitfield Estates, an affluent suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of Savannah, where perfectly manicured lawns stretched before elegant homes and children played freely without supervision. It was the kind of community where neighbors knew each other's names, where doors were left unlocked, where the most serious crime was occasionally stolen newspapers. Victoria Hayes and her husband Tyler West had worked hard to provide this safe, comfortable life for their only daughter. Victoria was a marketing executive at a local firm. Tyler managed a successful dental practice. They were devoted parents who carefully planned every aspect of Madison's upbringing with meticulous attention and genuine love. For Madison's 3rd birthday, Victoria had hired Sunshine Events, a well-regarded party planning company that specialized in children's celebrations. The company had excellent reviews, reasonable prices, and a reputation for creating memorable experiences that parents and children both enjoyed. The backyard had been transformed into what looked like a fairy tale setting. Pink and purple balloons created archways and clusters throughout the space. A small inflatable castle stood in one corner. Face painting stations, craft tables, and a specially designed balloon tunnel attracted children like moths to flame. The tunnel was perhaps the most popular attraction, a colorful passage constructed from hundreds of balloons where children could crawl through while squealing with delight. Sunshine Events provided 3 staff members to supervise activities and ensure every child had a wonderful time. Everything appeared absolutely perfect. Everything seemed completely safe. The party began at 2 o'clock on that Saturday afternoon. Approximately 20 children attended, ranging in age from 2 to 6 years old, accompanied by their parents who mingled on the patio while enjoying refreshments and casual conversation. Madison initially stayed close to her mother's side, observing the other children with her characteristic shyness. But gradually, encouraged by Victoria and drawn by the colorful attractions, she ventured toward the play areas. One of the Sunshine Events staff members, a pleasant woman in her 40s named Brooke Carter, took special interest in Madison, gently encouraging her to join the other children in the balloon tunnel. Victoria watched her daughter crawl into the tunnel entrance, saw her purple dress disappear into the colorful passage, and turned back to her conversation with another parent. That moment lasted perhaps 45 seconds. When Victoria looked back toward the play area, children were emerging from the tunnel's exit. But Madison was not among them. Victoria's initial reaction was mild concern rather than panic. Madison was shy and might have decided to stay inside the tunnel longer. Perhaps she'd become frightened and crawled back toward the entrance. Victoria walked calmly to the balloon tunnel, called her daughter's name, received no response. She checked the entrance. Empty. She checked the exit. Empty. The tunnel was completely vacant. A small flutter of anxiety began in Victoria's chest. She checked the inflatable castle. Madison wasn't there. She checked the craft table, the face painting station, behind the decorative balloon clusters. No Madison. The flutter of anxiety transformed into something sharper, more urgent. Victoria began calling Madison's name more loudly, her voice carrying a new edge that made other parents pause their conversations and look up with concern. Tyler joined the search immediately. Together, they systematically checked every location in the backyard. They looked inside the garden shed, behind bushes, under the patio furniture. Madison was nowhere. Tyler ran inside the house, checking every room, every closet, calling his daughter's name with increasing desperation. Victoria remained in the backyard, her mind racing through possibilities, each one more frightening than the last. Within 5 minutes, every adult at the party was searching. Within 10 minutes, panic had replaced the festive atmosphere completely. Within 15 minutes, someone had called 911. By 3 o'clock, Savannah Police Department had cordoned off the property and launched a full-scale search operation that would eventually involve more than 200 law enforcement personnel, search dogs, helicopters, and volunteers from throughout the county. But Madison Grant had vanished as completely as if she had never existed at all. The initial investigation was massive, urgent, and ultimately frustrating in its complete lack of productive leads. Detective Logan Pierce, a seasoned investigator with 15 years of experience, took command of the case with grim determination. Every parent who attended the party was interviewed extensively. Every neighbor within a 3-block radius was questioned. Every registered sex offender in the county was located and interrogated. Security footage from nearby homes and businesses was collected and analyzed frame by frame. The Sunshine Event staff members, including Brooke Carter, underwent intensive questioning. Carter's statements were documented carefully. She claimed Madison had entered the balloon tunnel with several other children. She'd been supervising the face painting station at the time and hadn't directly observed Madison exit the tunnel. She assumed, like everyone else, that the child had simply moved to another activity area. Her background check revealed nothing suspicious. She had no criminal record, no concerning associations, perfectly normal employment history spanning 12 years with various event companies. Without physical evidence or witness testimony placing her in direct contact with Madison at the moment of disappearance, investigators had no grounds to hold her. The search expanded beyond the neighborhood. Every vehicle that had been in the area that afternoon was identified and investigated. Traffic cameras were reviewed. Toll booth records were examined. Airports, bus stations, and train terminals were alerted. Madison's photograph appeared on every local news broadcast, was printed on thousands of flyers, was shared across emerging internet platforms. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children became involved. The FBI opened a case file. Tips poured in from across the country, each one meticulously investigated, none leading anywhere productive. Psychics offered their services. Amateur detectives proposed theories. The media coverage was intense and relentless. For weeks, the Grant family's tragedy dominated headlines throughout Georgia and beyond. But as weeks became months without any breakthrough, media attention gradually faded. The massive search operation scaled back. Tips decreased in frequency and quality. Detective Pierce continued working the case with dedicated persistence, but new leads had stopped appearing. By early 1998, the Madison Grant disappearance had been classified as a cold case, filed away with hundreds of other unsolved missing persons investigations. Victoria Hayes refused to. She taught herself about criminal psychology, child trafficking networks, illegal adoption processes, anything that might provide insight into what had happened to her daughter. Victoria became a regular presence on internet forums dedicated to missing children cases. She connected with other parents living the same nightmare, forming a network of grief-stricken mothers and fathers who refused to accept that their children were simply gone forever. Some of these parents had been searching for decades. Their children, now adults, who might not even remember their original families. Victoria drew strange comfort from these connections, knowing she wasn't alone in her endless limbo between hope and despair. She attended conferences on missing and exploited children, always sitting in the front row, always asking the most detailed questions, always networking with investigators and advocates who might have information. She became an expert on Amber Alerts, age progression technology, and the psychological profiles of child abductors. Her education in tragedy was comprehensive and consuming. The financial cost of Victoria's search was staggering. The 3 private investigators she hired over the years consumed her savings, Tyler's divorce settlement, and money borrowed from family members who worried about her mental state but couldn't refuse her desperate requests. One investigator traced a rumor about a child matching Madison's description, seen in Atlanta, leading Victoria on a frantic drive only to discover the lead was based on mistaken identity. Another investigator convinced Victoria that Madison might have been taken to Mexico, resulting in weeks of searching through border towns and exhausting every resource before admitting the trail was cold. The third investigator, whom Victoria trusted most, worked diligently for 2 years before finally admitting that without new evidence, there was simply nowhere left to look. Victoria paid him anyway, thanking him for his honesty even as it broke her heart all over again. The neighborhood eventually moved on, as neighborhoods do. Families who had attended that tragic birthday party relocated to other cities, trying to escape the shadow of trauma that seemed to hang over Whitfield Estates. New residents moved in, unaware of the terrible event that had occurred there, occasionally commenting to Victoria about what a lovely neighborhood it was for raising children. Victoria would smile politely and say nothing, unable to shatter their innocent perception of safety. The balloon tunnel, the inflatable castle, all the festive decorations had been immediately removed and destroyed in the days following Madison's disappearance. The backyard where Madison vanished was redesigned completely, as though erasing the physical space might somehow erase the pain. Tyler had insisted on this before the divorce, hiring landscapers to transform the entire area into something unrecognizable. But Victoria couldn't erase anything. The new landscaping didn't matter. She could still see the exact spot where the balloon tunnel had stood, could still picture Madison's purple dress disappearing into that colorful passage. She remained trapped on June 7, 1997, unable to move forward while her daughter remained missing, Jing in her mind but forever 3 years old in her heart. Detective Pierce retired from the Savannah Police Department in 2015, but he never stopped thinking about Madison Grant. The case haunted him throughout his career and into retirement. He'd investigated dozens of missing persons cases, solved most of them, but Madison's disappearance remained the one failure he couldn't accept. In retirement, Pierce had time to review the case files repeatedly, searching for overlooked details, examining every statement and piece of evidence with fresh perspective. He maintained contact with Victoria Hayes, checking in periodically, assuring her that he hadn't forgotten her daughter. Both of them were growing older, hope fading incrementally with each passing year, resignation slowly replacing determination. Neither could have anticipated that the key to solving Madison's disappearance wouldn't come from new evidence about her case, but from an entirely different tragedy occurring 2,000 miles away. But what happened in Arizona in June 2019 would finally crack open the mystery that had consumed 2 decades. June 15, 2019. Scottsdale, Arizona. 4-year-old Harper Lang vanished from her own backyard birthday party in circumstances that were disturbingly familiar to anyone who remembered the Madison Grant case. The party had been organized by a company called Creative Celebrations. Approximately 30 children attended. Harper was last seen entering a decorated play tunnel structure. Within minutes, she had vanished completely. Her mother, Autumn Blake, experienced the same nightmare that Victoria Hayes had lived through 22 years earlier. The frantic search, the police investigation, the media coverage, the devastating realization that her child had simply disappeared. But this time, something was different. This time, investigators had 22 years of technological advancement and a database of similar cases to compare against. Detective Hayden Price, leading the Harper Lang investigation, began researching similar disappearances nationwide. The pattern he discovered made his blood run cold. Over a 25-year period, at least 17 children had vanished from backyard birthday parties across 12 different states. All were between ages 3 and 5. All disappeared from supervised celebrations organized by professional party planning companies. All vanished within minutes, leaving no physical evidence. The companies had different names across different states, but careful investigation revealed they were all connected through a complex web of shell corporations and shared personnel. One name appeared in records related to multiple disappearances across different states and years. Brooke Carter had worked for party companies under several different names, always in roles that gave her direct access to children. Detective Price immediately contacted the FBI. Special Agent Dylan McCarthy was assigned to lead what rapidly became a massive federal investigation spanning multiple states and decades. McCarthy began systematically contacting investigators and families from every case that matched the pattern. When he reached out to Detective Pierce regarding the Madison Grant case, the two men recognized they were pursuing something far larger than isolated incidents. They were uncovering an organized criminal enterprise that had been operating with disturbing efficiency for at least 25 years. The FBI investigation intensified rapidly. Financial records were subpoenaed from dozens of shell companies. Surveillance was established on current and former employees of the connected party planning businesses. Phone records dating back years were analyzed. Bank transactions were traced through multiple jurisdictions. Undercover agents were deployed. The investigation was meticulous, patient, and absolutely determined to expose every person involved in what was emerging as one of the largest illegal adoption networks in American history. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In December 2019, a woman named Chelsea Morgan contacted the FBI hotline with information that would prove devastating to the entire operation. Morgan had worked for one of the party companies in the early 2000s before quitting and moving to Canada, where she'd lived for nearly 2 decades. After seeing news coverage of Harper Lang's disappearance and the FBI investigation, her conscience had finally overwhelmed her silence. Morgan provided detailed testimony about how the operation functioned. The party companies were legitimate businesses that genuinely organized children's celebrations, but they also served as hunting grounds for a small group of individuals who identified potential children to abduct. The targets were always very young, typically between ages 3 and 5, young enough that their memories would be unreliable or could be completely erased with time. They specifically selected quiet, shy children who wouldn't immediately draw attention if they briefly wandered away from supervised activities. The actual abductions required careful timing and coordination. During the chaos of a busy party with dozens of children and distracted parents, a child could be quietly led away, placed in a waiting vehicle, and driven away within 90 seconds. The vehicles were always generic, unmemorable models with false license plates. The child would be immediately transported to a safe house, where their appearance would be altered through haircuts, clothing changes, sometimes even colored contact lenses for older children. Within 24 hours, the child would be delivered to a waiting couple who had paid substantial sums for the illegal adoption. These weren't random buyers. They were carefully vetted couples who were wealthy, desperate for children, and willing to pay enormous amounts while asking absolutely no questions about the child's origin. The operation provided falsified birth certificates, backdated photographs, fabricated medical records, everything necessary to make the adoption appear completely legitimate. The couples genuinely believed they were participating in a gray market, but not necessarily criminal adoption process. Many convinced themselves they were rescuing children from troubled circumstances. The psychological gymnastics people perform to justify what they desperately want to believe are truly remarkable. Armed with Morgan's testimony and months of investigative work, the FBI executed coordinated raids in January 2020 across 7 states simultaneously. 12 individuals were arrested on charges including kidnapping, human trafficking, conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering. Among those arrested was Brooke Carter, now 63 years old and living under an assumed name in Florida. The operation had generated an estimated $40 million over 2 decades. At least 23 children had been abducted and illegally adopted through this network. Some adoptive families cooperated immediately when contacted by investigators, their worlds collapsing as they realized the children they'd raised had been stolen. Others hired expensive lawyers and fought desperately to retain the children they'd loved for years, arguing that removing children from the only families they'd ever known would constitute additional trauma. The legal and ethical complications were staggering and unprecedented. The FBI found themselves navigating impossible ethical territory. There was Jessica, a 15-year-old honor student in Texas who had been abducted at age 4 from a birthday party in Ohio. Her biological parents had divorced years ago, both remarried, both starting new families. Her adoptive parents had raised her with genuine love and devotion, providing opportunities her biological family couldn't have afforded. Jessica herself, when told the truth, became hysterical and refused to meet her biological parents, insisting that her adoptive family were her real parents, regardless of the circumstances of her adoption. The court eventually ruled that forcing her to return to biological parents she didn't remember would be more harmful than allowing her to remain with the family who had raised her, though the biological parents were granted visitation rights that Jessica refused to exercise. How do you handle situations where children had been raised for a decade or more by families who genuinely loved them but had obtained them through criminal means? How do you balance the rights of biological parents against the emotional bonds formed over years of daily care and love? These questions had no easy answers, no legal precedents that felt adequate to the moral complexity involved. There was Daniel, who had been taken at age 3 from a backyard barbecue in Michigan and raised in California. At 21, he was serving in the military when DNA analysis revealed his true identity. He chose to maintain relationships with both his biological and adoptive families, somehow managing to build bridges between two completely separate worlds. His biological mother described meeting him as both a blessing and a heartbreak. Grateful he was alive, but grieving for all the years she'd lost, all the moments she'd never witnessed. His adoptive parents faced criminal charges despite their genuine ignorance of the adoption's illegal nature. Their lives destroyed by revelations they'd never suspected. There was Lily, abducted at age 5 from a school playground and raised in Oregon. At 19, she struggled with severe identity crisis and required intensive psychological treatment after learning the truth. She attempted suicide twice before finding a therapist who specialized in complex trauma. She eventually wrote a memoir about her experience that became a bestseller, using her platform to advocate for better systems to prevent illegal adoptions and support recovery for stolen children. Her story provided some small measure of meaning to her suffering, transforming personal tragedy into social advocacy that might prevent future crimes. Each recovered child represented a unique tragedy with no template for resolution. Some biological families were overjoyed despite the complications. Others found the reunions painful and awkward, discovering they'd built entirely separate lives that didn't easily accommodate the children they'd lost. Some adoptive parents genuinely hadn't known they were participating in kidnapping and were devastated by the revelations. Others had deliberately ignored obvious warning signs because they'd wanted children so desperately they'd convinced themselves not to ask questions that might reveal uncomfortable truths. The legal system struggled to determine appropriate punishments for people whose crimes were motivated by desperate desire for children rather than malice. Though the impact on biological families and stolen children was devastating regardless of motivation. DNA analysis became the crucial tool for identifying abducted children who were now teenagers or young adults. The FBI created a database comparing DNA from missing children's biological families against DNA voluntarily provided by young people who had reasons to question their own origins. In March 2020, a DNA match confirmed what Victoria Hayes had desperately hoped for and simultaneously dreaded for 23 years. Madison Grant was alive. She was now 26 years old. She had been raised in California by a wealthy couple who had paid $200,000 in 1997 for an illegal adoption arranged through intermediaries. She had grown up believing her name was Sophia Palmer. She had no memories of her early childhood before age 4. She had no knowledge that she'd been abducted. She had been loved, educated, provided with every advantage and opportunity. She had graduated from a prestigious university. She was beginning a career in environmental science. She was by all external measures happy and successful. She was also not Madison Grant anymore, not in any meaningful psychological sense. The FBI arranged for Victoria Hayes to be contacted privately before any public announcements. Special Agent McCarthy traveled to Savannah personally to deliver the news that would fulfill Victoria's greatest hope while simultaneously shattering what remained of her heart. "Your daughter is alive," McCarthy told her gently, his voice carrying both relief and sorrow. "She's healthy, she's safe, she's successful, but she doesn't remember you. She doesn't remember being Madison. She has another family, another life, another identity. Do you want to meet her?" Victoria's response was immediate despite the tears streaming down her face. "Yes," she whispered, "and yes, I need to see her, even if she doesn't remember me. Even if I'm just a stranger to her, I need to see her." The meeting was arranged carefully with psychological professionals present to support both women through the encounter. Victoria traveled to California, accompanied by Detective Pierce, who had insisted on being there for this moment after more than 2 decades of searching. They met in a neutral location, a comfortable conference room in an FBI field office, carefully designed to be non-threatening and private. When Sophia Palmer walked into that room, Victoria Hayes saw her daughter for the first time in 23 years. The purple dress and white shoes were gone, replaced by professional attire. The 3-year-old child had become an adult woman, but Victoria recognized her instantly. The shape of her face, the color of her eyes, certain mannerisms and expressions that DNA can't explain, but mothers recognize instinctively. Sophia approached this meeting with understandable confusion and emotional complexity. She'd been informed that her entire childhood had been based on a lie, that she'd been abducted, that her adoptive parents had unknowingly participated in a criminal enterprise. She was processing shock, anger, betrayal, and grief for the only family she'd ever known, while simultaneously meeting a biological mother she couldn't remember. The conversation that followed was stilted, painful, and achingly sad. Victoria tried to share memories of Madison's first 3 years, stories about a little girl Sophia couldn't remember being. Sophia listened politely but couldn't connect emotionally to a past that felt completely foreign. She expressed sympathy for Victoria's suffering but couldn't reciprocate the maternal love that Victoria so desperately wanted to share. She was meeting a stranger who happened to share her DNA, not reuniting with her mother. The meeting lasted 90 minutes and ended with an awkward hug that felt more like obligation than connection. In the weeks that followed their initial meeting, Victoria and Sophia maintained contact through occasional emails and brief phone calls, each interaction feeling like careful negotiation across a minefield of emotion and expectation. Sophia was cordial but emotionally distant, maintaining boundaries that Victoria desperately wanted to cross, but respected out of fear of pushing her away entirely. She was processing extraordinary trauma and upheaval in her own life. Her adoptive parents, the only parents she'd ever known, were facing potential criminal charges despite having genuinely believed the adoption was legal. Her entire understanding of her own identity and history had been revealed as fabrication. She was angry at everyone involved, struggling with profound questions about nature versus nurture, trying to navigate impossible emotional terrain while maintaining her own mental health and stability. Victoria attempted to build connection through small gestures. She sent Sophia photographs from her first 3 years, hoping they might trigger some buried memory or emotional response. Sophia looked at images of a toddler she couldn't recognize as herself, a little girl in a purple dress standing in a backyard she'd never consciously seen. The pictures evoked intellectual curiosity but no emotional connection. Victoria shared stories about Madison's early childhood, how she'd loved stuffed animals and refused to eat anything green, how she'd had a specific giggle when playing peekaboo. Sophia listened politely, sometimes taking notes as though documenting someone else's history, but couldn't access feelings about experiences she couldn't remember living. They attempted having lunch together 3 times over a 6-month period. Each meeting followed the same uncomfortable pattern. Victoria would arrive early, anxious and hopeful, rehearsing conversation topics that might build bridges. Sophia would arrive exactly on time, professional and guarded, treating the encounter more like an obligation than a reunion. They'd make small talk about Sophia's work, Victoria's life in Savannah, carefully avoiding the enormous grief and loss that sat between them like an uninvited guest. Victoria would catch herself staring at Sophia's face, searching for traces of the 3-year-old she remembered, seeing familiar features but finding a stranger behind them. Sophia would notice these gazes and politely look away, uncomfortable with the intensity of emotion she couldn't reciprocate. The meals always ended with awkward hugs and promises to stay in touch that both women suspected might not be kept. Sophia began therapy specifically to process her complex feelings about the situation. Her therapist helped her understand that she wasn't obligated to force feelings that didn't exist, that her inability to connect with Victoria wasn't a moral failing, but a psychological reality. Children adopted at very young ages often don't form attachments to biological parents they don't remember, the therapist explained. Your brain developed with different parents. Your attachment systems, your sense of identity, your emotional bonds, all formed with the people who raised you. Meeting your biological mother doesn't erase that development or automatically create the relationship she wants. You're not Madison Grant anymore because you never were Madison Grant in any conscious, remembered sense. You've always been Sophia Palmer, and that's okay. This therapeutic insight gave Sophia permission to establish firmer boundaries with Victoria. She sent an email, carefully worded and kind but absolutely clear, explaining that while she appreciated Victoria's suffering and respected their biological connection, she couldn't be the daughter Victoria wanted her to be. She suggested they limit contact to occasional emails on birthdays and holidays, maintaining a distant but cordial relationship rather than forcing intimacy that felt artificial and painful for both of them. Victoria received this email and wept for hours, understanding intellectually that Sophia was right, but feeling emotionally demolished by the second loss of her daughter. She'd found Madison but couldn't keep her, couldn't build the relationship she'd dreamed about for 23 years of searching. She appreciated Victoria's patience but couldn't force feelings that didn't exist. She couldn't become Madison Grant again because Sophia Palmer was the only person she'd ever been, the only identity that felt real and true despite its fraudulent origins. Victoria slowly came to accept a devastating truth that she'd never anticipated during all those years of searching. Finding Madison didn't mean getting her daughter back. It meant discovering that her daughter no longer existed in any recoverable form. The 3-year-old who loved purple dresses and stuffed animals had been erased, replaced by a completely different person with different memories, different relationships, different identity. Madison Grant had died on June 7, 1997, not physically but psychologically, her personality and memories and potential future stolen as completely as if death had taken her. Sophia Palmer might carry Madison's DNA, but she wasn't Victoria's daughter in any meaningful emotional sense. The reunion Victoria had dreamed about for 2 decades turned out to be another form of loss, perhaps even more painful than the original disappearance, because now there was no hope left to sustain her. The legal proceedings following the FB1 operation were lengthy, complex, and emotionally devastating for everyone involved. Brooke Carter and 6 other core members of the adoption ring faced trial in federal court over a period of 8 months. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, thousands of documents, financial records tracing millions of dollars, testimony from Chelsea Morgan and other former associates who had agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. The defense attorneys attempted various strategies, arguing that the adoptive parents were the real criminals, that their clients had merely facilitated arrangements that resulted in children being placed in loving homes, that no children had been physically harmed. These arguments failed spectacularly. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges. The sentencing hearings stretched across multiple days as biological parents were given opportunities to deliver victim impact statements. Victoria Hayes stood before the court, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face, and described 23 years of living in limbo between hope and despair. She talked about the birthday cakes she'd baked every year for a daughter who wasn't there to blow out the candles. She described the countless nights she'd lain awake, imagining terrible fates that might have befallen Madison. She explained how the truth, when it finally came, had brought both relief and a new form of agony, because finding her daughter alive meant discovering that Madison no longer existed in any recoverable form. Other parents delivered statements that ranged from rage to heartbreak. One father described how the disappearance of his son had led to divorce, bankruptcy, and a decade of alcoholism before he finally found sobriety and rebuilt his life, only to discover his son was alive but didn't want to meet him. A mother talked about her daughter who had been recovered but was so traumatized by learning the truth that she'd attempted suicide and now required round-the-clock psychiatric care. Another mother described the bittersweet experience of reuniting with a son who maintained relationships with both families but could never fully belong to either, forever torn between 2 identities and 2 sets of parents. Brooke Carter sat through these statements with no visible emotion, her face a mask of indifference that enraged the families who had suffered because of her crimes. When the judge asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, everyone expected a perfunctory statement, or perhaps silence. What Carter said instead would haunt Victoria Hayes and everyone else in that courtroom for the rest of their lives. "I'm not sorry," Carter said, her voice cold and devoid of remorse, meeting Victoria's eyes directly without flinching. Those children got better lives than they would have had. They were raised by families who desperately wanted them, who could provide opportunities their biological parents couldn't afford. Madison Grant would have been just another middle-class kid in Georgia. Sophia Palmer got to attend prestigious schools, travel the world, develop her potential in ways that would never have been possible otherwise. You should thank me for giving your daughter a better life than you ever could have provided. The courtroom erupted in outrage. Multiple people shouted protests. Security officers had to restrain one father who lunged toward Carter. The judge pounded his gavel repeatedly, threatening to clear the courtroom if order wasn't restored. But the words had been spoken and couldn't be unsaid, couldn't be unheard. Victoria sat frozen, tears streaming down her face, unable to speak or move or process what she just heard. Because somewhere in the deepest, most painful part of her heart, in a place she'd never admit to anyone, she wondered if Carter might be partially right. Sophia had been given advantages, opportunities, education, experiences that Victoria might not have been able to provide on a marketing executive's salary in Savannah. Sophia was successful and accomplished and happy in ways that might not have been possible if she'd remained Madison Grant. If she'd grown up in that house in Whitfield Estates with parents whose marriage collapsed under the weight of grief, the thought was unbearable, unacceptable, morally repugnant, a betrayal of everything Victoria had fought for over 2 decades. And yet it existed in her mind, poisoning even the small comfort of knowing her daughter was alive. She hated Carter for planting this seed of doubt, for making her question whether her 23 years of suffering had been in service of something that wasn't actually in Madison's best interest. The judge sentenced Carter to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, the harshest sentence available under federal guidelines. But no sentence could undo what had been done, could restore the years that had been stolen, could transform Sophia Palmer back into Madison Grant. Victoria Hayes continued living in Savannah, in the same house where Madison had spent her first 3 years. The backyard had been redesigned multiple times over the decades, but Victoria still avoided looking at the space where the balloon tunnel had stood. She maintained occasional contact with Sophia, who gradually became more comfortable with brief visits, though they never developed the mother-daughter relationship Victoria had dreamed about. Sophia eventually asked Victoria to stop baking birthday cakes every June 7th, explaining that the ritual felt morbid rather than touching. Victoria agreed, but privately she continued the tradition in her own kitchen, placing a single cupcake with a candle on the counter and sitting alone in the darkness, mourning a loss that had never ended. The case of Madison Grant became a catalyst for significant reforms in how missing children investigations are conducted. The FBI established new protocols for identifying pattern crimes across jurisdictions. Background checks for party planning employees became more rigorous. Databases for tracking missing children were enhanced with better technology and more comprehensive sharing across agencies. New laws were passed, making it significantly more difficult to falsify adoption records or create fraudulent identities for children. These improvements came too late for Madison and the other children stolen during those decades, but they potentially prevented future tragedies. Sometimes progress is built on the graves of those who suffered before changes were made. On June 7, 2022, 25 years after her daughter's disappearance, Victoria Hayes stood in her backyard and planted a Japanese maple tree in the exact spot where the balloon tunnel had stood a quarter century earlier. It was a small tree, fragile and young, but it would grow and mature with time, creating beauty from tragedy, life from loss. Detective Pierce, now in his 70s, attended the private ceremony along with Autumn Blake and a handful of others who had been touched by Madison's story. Sophia Palmer did not attend, but she sent a card expressing appreciation for Victoria's strength and expressing hope that eventually they might develop a more comfortable relationship. The card was signed Sophia, not Madison. Victoria accepted this with painful grace, understanding that demanding something that didn't exist would only create more suffering for everyone involved. The story of what happened on that June afternoon in 1997 doesn't have a happy ending in any traditional sense. The child was found but not recovered. Justice was served, but satisfaction remained elusive. Truth was discovered, but it didn't provide the healing that had been sought for decades. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones that don't resolve neatly, that refuse to provide comfortable conclusions or moral clarity. Life is more complicated than the narratives we construct to make sense of cause and suffering. Victoria Hayes searched for 23 years to find her daughter. When she finally succeeded, she discovered that the daughter she'd been searching for no longer existed. if she ever had after that terrible afternoon. The 3-year-old girl in the purple dress was gone forever, replaced by a stranger who happened to carry the same DNA, but none of the shared history that creates family bonds. The lesson of Madison Grant's story isn't about perseverance, being rewarded, or truth setting us free, or any of the comfortable platitudes we tell ourselves about tragedy. The lesson is that some losses are permanent regardless of outcomes. That finding answers doesn't always bring closure. That love alone cannot overcome time and circumstance. That children stolen at young ages don't simply resume their original lives when recovered because the person they were meant to become has been erased and replaced by someone entirely different. Victoria Hayes demonstrated extraordinary strength, dedication, and maternal love for more than 2 decades. She never gave up when others might have. She kept her daughter's memory alive when the world moved on. And her reward for all that suffering and determination was discovering that victory and loss aren't always distinguishable from each other. As I conclude this devastating story, I want you to consider how fragile identity really is. How much of who we are depends on the first few years of life, how completely a person can be erased and replaced while their body continues living. Madison Grant vanished on June 7, 1997, but finding Sophia Palmer in 2020 didn't bring her back. It simply confirmed that some disappearances are permanent regardless of physical recovery. The birthday that should have been a celebration of life became the day a child's entire existence ended and a different person's life began. And 23 years of searching led to the most painful discovery imaginable, that sometimes finding what you've lost reveals it can never truly be recovered. If this story of a mother's unending search and the devastating truth she finally discovered has left you thinking about the nature of identity, family, and what it really means to lose someone, subscribe to this channel for more deep investigations into cases that challenge everything we think we understand about loss and recovery. These aren't just stories about missing persons. They're explorations of how human beings survive unbearable circumstances and what happens when the answers we seek turn out to be more painful than the questions that tormented us. Thank you for staying with me through this difficult journey. Until the next investigation, remember that sometimes the people we're searching for are already gone, even when they're standing right in front of us.